As we discussed, I'm Ari Meltzer. I'm an associate here at Wiley Ryan. As we discussed earlier in the program, simultaneous with the filing of the construction permits, or the 3-month sprint as we called it, there's also going to be the process of filing for reimbursement. As you all, I believe, know, in the Spectrum Act, Congress allocated $1.75 billion for the TV Broadcaster Relocation Fund. That includes reimbursement both for broadcast expenses and for MVPD expenses relating to the channel repacking. The Spectrum Act called for the FCC to reimburse broadcasters for expenses that are reasonably incurred. And that raises a host of issues like what's reasonable, how the FCC will allocate that funds, and even when broadcasters are going to receive those funds. So to walk us through some of those issues, we have to my immediate right, Pam Gallant. She's an associate division chief in the FCC's Media Bureau. We have Joe Davis, a television and radio consulting engineer and the president of Chesapeake RF Consultants, LLC. And Patrick McFadden, associate general counsel for the National Association of Broadcasters. Now, the thought behind this panel is we really want to stick more to procedure than policy, but I think one thing that's going to drive a lot of the procedure as far as the reimbursement goes is the question that was asked earlier, which is $1.75 billion going to be enough? We now know that the FCC is estimating somewhere between 1,200 and 1,400 stations being repacked. That includes Canadian stations and some of the VHF moves, but you're still probably looking in a range of 1,000 stations that might be eligible for reimbursement. So at $1.75 billion, you do the math, that's about $1.5 million per station on average, give or take. So I'll exempt Pam unless she wants to answer the question, but to Joe and Patrick, is that enough money?
No. No. So seriously, I think there's two ways of thinking about the answer to that question. First, as Ari mentioned, we have a couple new data points that have come out in the TSPPN. The FCC is estimating over 1,100 stations may move depending upon the clearing target. We also have an updated cost catalog. I would think between those two data points, the FCC, maybe us, could sharpen some estimates about what total costs might look like. The other milestone, of course, will be once cost estimates are submitted, we'll no longer be guessing about what the total cost request will be. I'll just take the opportunity to remind people that Chairman Wheeler has said a couple times on the Hill that if 1.75 turns out to not be enough, he will be at the front of the line asking Congress for more money. I remember him saying that, and we certainly intend to hold him to that promise. So we think we can make more educated guesses now that it will probably not be enough, but we'd love to be wrong about that, by the way. But we're all going to know no later than 3 months, I think, after the close of the auction when all the cost estimates are in.
Well, I'm concerned about the $1.75 billion. That also must include the cost for MVPDs to change their receive, that is the cable and dish type receptions. So a chunk of that's going to go there. They also get reimbursed. Some of the figures we saw in the recent simulation was 1,270 and change stations will be repacked. I think some of those are voluntary band changes, but the vast majority of those are involuntary stations, and those will get repacked and reimbursed. We have a trade-off between how fast you want it done versus how expensive it's going to be. The wireless guys want it done fast. The broadcasters would like to be reimbursed. So that's one of the issues that the FCC is dealing with on all this. And we also have the issue with interim or reduced power operations. When we try to transition, we want the broadcasters, of course, would like the interims to be as robust as possible, which is a more expensive interim solution. So I'm very concerned about $1.75 billion.
And to Patrick's point, yes, we're getting close to knowing, once we have all the estimates in, that will be when we'll be able to total them up and actually look at what we have. Where does demand fall? I think right now there are just too many variables. We don't know the number of stations or the type of stations. We don't know how many stations might propose sharing equipment, which could be a cost saver. We don't know how many Class A's will be repacked, which it's generally assumed to be less expensive to move a Class A. So we also don't know if there will be stations or even station groups that file for a service rule waiver, and if granted, that would forego reimbursement. So these are all things that we need to think about and watch to see what happens, and then wait for those estimates to come in.
And when you get those initial applications, so you're 3 months from the date of the was it, Duran? The CRPN. So within 3 months of the reassignment PN, that's the easy way to go. Broadcasters have to get those requests in for reimbursement along with their construction permits requests or construction permit applications. At that point, the FCC may not have the full 1.75 billion to work with. So do you want to walk us through that timing a little bit?
Right. It's fair to say we will not have access to the 1.75 billion. Because that's coming from the auction proceeds, which come from the wireless carriers, which are not obligated to pay us until they receive their licensing, and the licensing period takes several months. We will not have access to all the funds right up front. However, the statute anticipated this, and there's a provision that allows the commission to borrow $1 billion from the Treasury. We have a memorandum of understanding in place with the Treasury, so we're ready to execute that as soon as the channel reassignment PN comes out. So the first initial allocation will be based on both demand, we'll see what the estimates come in at, and on the $1 billion that we have available at that time. There will be, I think, and if you sort of parse through the report and order, this is anticipated, and the commission said there will be an additional allocation or even allocations as the additional funding becomes available.
So the report and order says that commercial broadcasters get 80% allocated up front, non-coms get 90 or up to 90%.
Up to 80% and up to 90%.
So how will you determine who gets how much of their initial allocation?
Well, again, we will look at total demand, and we will look at the amount available, and we will calculate the percentage, and then we will give each filing entity a percentage of their of demand, of the percentage of their estimates that they filed.
So you won't be able to actually start releasing any money to broadcasters until everybody has gotten their reimbursement requests in.
Their estimates?
Or their estimates, right?
Well, that's a great point, yes. We are going to be making the allocation based on collective demand, which means we do need a good estimate from every relocated station. And I know there's been some concern, completely justifiable, about timing and pressure and resources and whether it's reasonable to expect this at the 3-month mark. But we certainly expect, hope, even pray that all the repack stations will file an estimate at that time. Again, it's crucial in terms of allocating for everyone that we know what each station's estimate is. And we are, we're considering what to do if there are non-filers. In a way, I feel kind of like we're preaching to the choir here, because if you're here, you're well informed. You're probably working, either a consulting engineer working for a station, or just aware of what's going on. I'm worried about the small stations who haven't been following the auction, people who might fall through the cracks. And so we're considering whether there should be some sort of a default mechanism that we implement if there are stations that don't file.
Just one quick public service announcement on that. Please file your cost estimates on time. As Pam mentioned, the FCC hasn't decided what the result will be if you don't. I'm prepared to bet that you won't like the result if you don't. Please file it on time. It'll be a lot easier for the FCC. It'll be easier for all stakeholders. It'll provide a more accurate picture of what total costs are. Please get an estimate in. If you have to amend the estimate later, that's fine, but the cost catalog and other tools are available to people to try to get a timely estimate.
I'm guessing if the FCC does it for you, they're not going to round up.
True. Well, yeah, I think, let's face it, we would be picking from, among very unattractive options if we have to do something. But the cost catalog, that's a good sort of plug for using the cost catalog. That's one of the reasons we thought it was important to not only develop it in the first place, but to keep it up to date. And we've just, as you probably know, put out a public notice seeking comment on some updated prices. Due to the passage of time, no surprise that there are some reported price increases. But a station that's trying to meet the deadline to file its estimates is going to either need to have bids from its vendors or some sort of a price quote, or it can use the prices in the cost catalog. And that's sort of, we want to encourage stations to kind of lean on that cost catalog. These prices are vetted. They've been put out for comment several times. You can even use it to fill in the gaps. So, for example, if you've talked to your engineers and your antenna manufacturers, but you're not quite sure about tower crew or something like that, you can use the prices in the catalog to fill in whatever gaps you have when we reach the deadline for estimates.
And if somebody uses the catalog and later finds that their specific scenario is going to cost more, do they lose a priority in terms of if the funds become allocated based on everybody who got their specific requests in sooner?
No, in the end, we are paying on actual costs. So the estimates are important upfront to give us the sort of big picture of what demand is, and also to allocate a starting budget for each project. But, we realize they're estimates. So it is fully understandable and expected that actual invoice prices, which may come in, 18 months or even further down the road, will not necessarily line up with the estimates.
The thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is the initial allocation is based on the 3-month window, the filing at 3 months. You can amend the plan later, but the initial allocation stays set. So then if the fund does run short and you ran over your initial estimate, then there's a potential for a difficult situation, yes?
I think we have a lot of flexibility in how we're going to do subsequent allocations. I think it's fair to say that we haven't yet, that we have a lot of options in front of us, and we haven't yet exactly fleshed out how the second and third allocations will be calculated. Will they look at revised estimates? Will they look at just the 3-month mark estimates? I think those are open questions.
And Patrick and Joe, do you see a lot of broadcasters relying on the catalog? Does it depend on kind of the sophistication of the broadcaster and their resources, or what's going to determine whether a broadcaster says, that number looks good, or whether they're going out and getting specific bids, or is it just capacity in it? Is there even the availability to get bids during that 3-month period?
So I'll go ahead.
After you, please.
So at first, I just want to take a second to commend the FCC for putting out the cost catalog, updating the cost catalog, and putting the updated cost catalog out for comment. I think it's incumbent on broadcast. I hope everybody will look at the updated cost catalog, and if you have feedback, please provide it to the FCC, because it's something they're gonna use. It would be really useful if people would not provide the FCC with comments like everything's too low, or that's. But if there are specific and constructive pieces of feedback that you can provide the FCC, I think that would be great. I think the FCC is absolutely doing the right thing and putting it out for comment, and I think we should take them up on that offer. And by the way, I would also say if everything looks great in the cost catalog, please tell the FCC that too, because that's also useful feedback. Look, I think the 3-month window that was talked about a little bit on the previous panel. I know the subject of this panel is not the 39-month deadline, but I will digress briefly on that. I think that 39-month deadline, unfortunately, is painting the FCC into a little bit of a corner with a 3-month deadline because they want to start getting allocations out. So unfortunately, one decision that we don't think was reasonable has led to another decision that may not be reasonable. In a perfect world, everybody would submit a cost estimate based on conversations with their vendors and based on firm vendor quotes. That's what I would urge people to try to do. But again, within that 3-month window, if you're not able to do that, I think relying on the cost catalog may be, that may be your only option, but that is certainly an option that the FCC is providing you with to try to avoid a situation where you don't put in an estimate at all, which is the worst case scenario.
A few comments about the catalog. That was originally developed in 2013 by Widelity. Some of you know that I worked on the Widelity team at that time and helped prepare that catalog, and I also worked with them to prepare this revision. And I can tell you that the revision is pretty comprehensive, but there are a number of categories that are very station specific, and you're going to need to get those local bids from your local electricians and the people who are actually be doing any sort of building renovations. And the tower crew information, I think you're really going to need to talk to the tower crews because towers are just so different. I'd encourage you to get actual bids for that rather than relying on the catalog. There could be some tower strengthening involved. And also for those sites that are shared, all of that's going to have to be coordinated with the other stations that share the tower and the tower owner if it's a different entity. And that raises the complication quite a lot.
So Joe, you're going to have a lot of applications to file in 3 months. Do you anticipate having time to also help your clients?
As a solo practitioner, I can work 3 shifts, me, myself, and I. But the 3-month turnaround is going to be very, very difficult. And as it relates to reimbursements, in my opinion, there are going to be a number of placeholder applications filed at that 3-month limit, where at the priority window and then the non-priority window and then when the stay stations can file, those plans all get adjusted because some stations are sharing towers, they're sharing antennas, and plans won't be known until much later than that 3-month mark. So again, the reimbursement plan will also have to be adjusted to match that.
And to that point, I wanted to point out that the only relocated stations who are not required to file their estimates at the 3-month mark are those that fall into that priority window, those that are deemed, past muster as the impossibles to be considered there. The report and order says they don't have to file. So we are going to have a process for, dealing with their allocation separately. I would encourage those stations to file their estimates anyways. At that point, they've done enough engineering and probably enough examination of their transition to know that it's impossible to move where they've been assigned or under those parameters. And so hopefully they would have, enough information to at least get an estimate in. And again, that would be their information that we would then rely on rather than, whatever sort of default mechanism we put in place for those stations.
This is probably a good time to ask the question we got on the first panel, which was, is there a possibility of opening up the 399s early during that window once the confidential letters have come out?
Yeah, if I understand the question correctly, it was, we're going to get this confidential letter, which is designed to give us a head start. Can we also start filing our 399, which is the reimbursement form, and our CP at that time? And it's fair to say that yes, you'll be able to launch those applications in LMS. You're probably not going to want to, certify and submit them until closer to the deadline. But the 399, which is a new form, it's open for beta test, which we may talk a little bit more about, but it allows you to save as you go. So until you hit that last save and certify, or certify and submit, whatever it says, you can just keep it as a working document. So hopefully that will also help people that as they get information, as they get a bid from a vendor, as they learn something from their engineer, they can kind of do it as they go throughout that 3-month period, even starting before, once the letters are out.
If I could just add one thing on that. One other topic that came up in the previous panel was the confidential letters going out and the fact that the FCC is prohibited by the statute from putting out sort of everybody's new channel reassignment. I guess there are two considerations there. One, the need to maintain confidentiality under the Spectrum Act, but also the prohibited communications rules. I think we would certainly encourage the FCC to consider waiving the prohibited communications rules for broadcasters once the final stage rule in the reverse auction is satisfied, so that broadcasters could exchange information with each other about what their channels are, talk to their vendors, things like that. Once the final stage rule is satisfied in the reverse auction, I don't think there's any harm that can come from that. So we would encourage the FCC to look into that.
And regarding the confidential letters, are we talking U.S. Postal Service? Or is there a way for a licensee to log in through their FRN and retrieve their letter the day they're released?
We are planning on old-fashioned mail, and we just put out a PN and strongly encouraging everybody to keep their contact information and LMS up to date for that very reason. Whether they'll be sent certified or, I'm not sure about that. Overnight, okay, they will. Okay, they will be sent overnight. So that's.
And to clarify, a station that filed a 177, the letter would go to
Yes.
the address in the 177.
Yes.
Stations that did not file 177s, the letter would go to the address in
Yes,
LMS.
thank you for clarifying.
So as far as using your segue, that there's currently a beta period for 399s, broadcasters can log in, you can file a demo 399, go through the process, see how the prices fill in, and it's a fairly complex logical system that you start with one question, then it asks the next question
Right.
for those who
Right.
haven't logged in yet. What sort of feedback have you gotten so far?
Oh, we have a good number, I think over 20 people who are actually in the system, testing, playing with it, getting to know how it works. The good news is we were aware of most of the things that need to be fixed that have been pointed out. There are a couple others that we're looking into, but again, this is a beta test. We knew it wasn't perfect. We want to get input so that when we go to production, if there are any flaws that we've missed, we can be sure or be hopeful that we've caught everything. So if you're at all interested, I'd encourage you to participate in the beta test. We're going to take your feedback until November 4th. If you want to get set up, you can. You need an FRN, so you need to do that through the FCC's website that deals with FRNs. And then you can contact Form 399 beta at fcc.gov, and we'll help. If you're a broadcaster, you will have a facility ID. If you're a consultant, we'll help set you up with a facility ID just for purposes of this beta environment. And then you can also submit your feedback through that email.
If I could just once again take the opportunity to commend the FCC for doing the 399 beta test. I think it's a really useful process that they're doing, and I would really encourage people to hop in and kick the tires of the system for at least a couple reasons. One, the FCC is soliciting your feedback on that, so it'd be great to get feedback to them. Two, and actually. 1A, the FCC is going to have an FAQ section there. They can only determine what's FA if they get the Qs, so it would be great to sort of start identifying those things so that other broadcasters can learn from what you've submitted. The other reason that I would encourage people to hop in is so you get a sense of what kind of information you could be gathering now. I think Michael mentioned on the last panel that one of the things that broadcasters can be doing now to prepare for the transition is gathering information about their systems. It'd be great to sort of log into the 399 beta test and get a sense of what kind of information you're going to need and what would be useful to start gathering now.
It does, the various screens, and I have tried this, does ask you about your existing operation before it starts asking you about what you propose to buy. It says, well, tell us about your antenna. Is it a top mount? Is it a side mount? Is it directional? H pole, C pole? Is it in working order? And the same sorts of questions for the transmitters and other things. Is your tower up to Rev G? So all that stuff can be done well in advance.
Yes, and this if your station is Repack, you're going to become very familiar with this online reimbursement 399 form because you will use it to, as Joe said, identify your existing information. You'll use it to file your estimates. Once you have an actual expense, you will use that to submit a request for reimbursement. You'll use it to upload your supporting documentation, your invoice, or whatever it is. So it's something that you'll be using throughout the transition period.
And I guess as we continue our praise of the FCC and some of the things that it's done along this process, back in April, the commission put out a public notice that said that broadcasters who are doing preparation work at this time to get ready for the repack, that those expenses would be reimbursable to the extent that the station is eligible for reimbursement. Have people been taking advantage of that opportunity?
I've got several clients who have done structural studies with the intent of turning in those as expenses if those stations get repacked, yes. And antenna sweeps.
And what else can people be doing? I mean, is that really the extent of it, is until everybody gets their channel
Those are the big
reassignments?
things, yeah.
Yeah.
We've heard generally about planning, about the things that Joe's talking about, and just doing as much planning as they can. And if that requires hiring an expert or consultant, they feel that they can do that.
Now, we've gotten some email questions with some fairly specific fact patterns, and we're not, for the purpose of this panel, going to go into specific fact patterns about what is or is not reimbursable. But for somebody who wants to do some preparation work, there's something they think they can do now. It's not listed on the catalog. Any advice as to whether they should go forward, whether they should wait, or what they should do?
And I think there's always some risk that you might incur a cost that turns out not to be reimbursable, or for some reason that your station's not repacked. I assume that stations out there are weighing those risks. If it's something, if it's some work that you would have, maybe you should do anyways, regardless of the repack, but you've been holding off for whatever reason, you have to decide whether it makes sense to go ahead and do it. And then, if it's determined to be reimbursable and your station's repacked, then, bonus, you get paid for it. If not, you get the new whatever equipment or analysis you've purchased.
So we've had a lot of build-up to what I think is going to be the core question in the reimbursement process, which is the standard that the commission has to work with is it has to be a reasonable expense. We know that the catalog gives some sort of a default, almost presumptively, to the extent that it's deemed necessary, a presumptively reasonable expense. But how is the commission going to make that determination?
That is a good question. I mean, the reasonably incurred standard that's in the statute gives us flexibility, right? I mean, the Congress didn't say lowest cost or put any sort of other parameters around other than reasonably incurred. That means we can sort of do a couple things. We can consider on a case-by-case basis, based on a specific station's transition plan. And I think if you've read the transition PN or certainly listened to the webinar or the other day, I think you have probably heard quite often that every station is going to be different, that depending on a whole bunch of variables, how a station transition is going to, there are going to be variables. So what is appropriately reimbursable for one station might not be appropriately reasonable for another station. Another thing that we're going to be able to do, because we'll have a lot of data, is to sort of look across all of the submissions. And, we can sort of look at trends and we can look at outliers. So if we see, several stations, I'm just making this up, purchasing, for example, a particular type of equipment, and they're all within a range, except there are two stations that are claiming very high costs, way outliers. We would inquire about that. I'm not, we're not going to prejudge. I'm not, certainly not, don't mean to imply that we would decline to pay those higher prices, but we would definitely inquire. It's something we would have to, we would have to ask the station for some sort of documentation or justification as to why their costs are, appear to be higher than others for what appears to be the same type of equipment. And I also wanted to say that the public will have this ability too, because all of the submissions will be publicly viewable, with some exceptions. The things that the public won't see are the contact information for a station. They won't see the vendor's name or their tax ID number, and they won't see the actual invoice or supporting documentation that's filed. But you'll be able to look and see which station is purchasing, and what they're paying for their antenna, for example,
Is that by category or by individual item?
by line item.
And of course, you have an army of thousands who are going to be looking over those 399s to process them quickly.
Not thousands, but certainly we will supplement our federal team. The commission allowed the Media Bureau to undertake a procurement to hire some help, to hire a reimbursement contractor, and we are in the middle of that procurement and hopefully going to get some assistance soon.
Any sense of how long it's going to take to actually, once you've gotten that last reimbursement estimate in, to go through that evaluation process?
Oh, from the time that the estimates come in?
Right.
I mean, I don't want to commit us here, but that's something that's going to happen quickly. That's going to be, in all hands, because we, we're very sensitive of the timing, and, let's face it, the commission, we can't on the one hand say we're holding everyone to this transition schedule, and on the other hand say, well, we're going to not get the money out for a while. So we realize that, that the money, making the allocations, making sure that stations know what their budgets are is, crucial to the success of the transition plan.
Well, the other aspect of that is if the commission decides that a particular item is not eligible for reimbursement, then the station may adjust its plan.
And as far as determining some of the factors that might go into a reasonability determination, one of the things, now that we know that there is this proposal out there in the transition stage public notice to have these 10 phases, will there be any accounting for the fact that it may be more expensive for a broadcaster to transition in an earlier phase, whether they have to pay any expedite fees, whether there's any other just costs that come with transitioning earlier than later in the process?
I mean, we don't have any evidence of that right now. If I had to guess, I would say that having this plan, imposing some organization on the transition would sort of help with costs, right? There won't be so many spikes in demand. It'll sort of even things out throughout the 36-month period. So, I don't know that would be the case. We certainly haven't heard it, but, could be.
Joe, any guess whether it's going to be more expensive for a station to transition in some of the earlier stages?
I was trying to think about that, and the example I came up with is not a reimbursable one. But I'll recite it to you anyway, and that is in the earlier phases, in these daisy chains, the target is to have the stations that move downward first, and the stations at the tail end of the daisy chain are the stations that are at the top end of the channel. For instance, those stations that are in the wireless band now will probably be at the last part of the transition. But the example I thought of, again, which is not reimbursable, would be the stations that are voluntarily going to low VHF, and that band is pretty much vacant right now, so perhaps they'd be put in one of the early phases. But then there's the development issue with developing low V transmitters, which are not available today, and is there going to be extra cost and time associated with that? And the same with low V antennas. The manufacturers can make them, but they haven't done that in a long time.
Yep. And Patrick, you indicated earlier that stations should at least give a good thought as to whether they're going to follow the catalog or whether they've got expenses that vary from what the catalog expenses. But of course, there's the balancing for broadcasters on that the more broadcasters who are submitting specific requests that are going to require evaluation, potentially the longer it's going to take to approve and evaluate those requests. Any advice for how should broadcasters be worried about that?
No, I think if you're a broadcaster, your obligation is to try to get your estimate as right as you can. That should be your priority. Yep, you absolutely should get it in at 3 months, but don't lowball yourself in an effort to speed the FCC's ability to process all of the estimates. Include everything that you think you're going to need and try to get your estimate as accurate and complete as you possibly can.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience. Again, we don't want to address any specific hypotheticals, but if you've got something a little bit more about the process, we can answer those. We got a question over there first.
A little background here. I was Director of Engineering of Public Television Network System in New Jersey for a number of years. And of course, public stations, at least the larger ones, get NTIA grants. This process that the FCC is proposing is exactly the same as NTIA used. There was a catalog with prices. You did a proposal, and when you requested the grant money, you had to include the listing that you're talking about. And it turned out, at least with NTIA, that when you went to build the station, if you did it in a reasonable amount of time, you weren't short. They didn't put bottom line prices in their catalog. And while I haven't completely reviewed the current situation, it seems to me it's a doable thing. And we did all of this at the station level. We did not go out and get an accountant. In fact, the business department didn't even do it. It was delegated to me as the engineer. So those of you with non-commercial clients, they should know how to do this.
I have a comment about that. We're speaking of non-commercial issues, and your last question to me about stations in the early phases. Some of the non-commercial stations are owned by universities and otherwise state-owned. They have a specific procurement process that they have to go through, and it's not simple, and it's not short, and it's certainly not efficient. They have to put things out to bid over a certain amount, like $50,000 or more, has to be put out for bid, and it can't be bid until it's actually added to their budget. So they have a lot of red tape to go through, so that's a challenge for those stations towards the first phase.
We have another question over here.
Hi, Dave Sigler, Cox Media Group. I want to just overly reinforce the point that Mr. Adrick made earlier about FMs that could be affected, and this is none of the fault of their own, where they may need to relocate temporarily or, what a sort of change to make sure that there's a process and a reimbursement process for them, since right now the process is that it's going to go under the TV's call letters. So to put a mechanism in place to accommodate that.
And I don't think you're going to like the answer, but I think the public notice does address that, correct? Or the report order, sorry.
Yeah, the statute only allows reimbursement to be paid to relocated television stations. To the extent that a station is sharing a tower with either other non-relocated repacked TV stations or FM, they can only get reimbursed for any expenses incurred by those other parties if they have a contractual relationship which imposes an obligation on that TV station to pay the costs of, for example, the FM station. So there are a lot of FM stations that might be affected. Not sure how much, assistance they're going to get from the television stations.
And certainly that's, with the catalog, that was addressed in the report and order, but that is something that if there's an opportunity, if people are interested, obviously, to make that point to the commission. We have an email question that came in, which is, will field strength measurements made before and after a transition to investigate the potential for new interference be eligible for reimbursement? I know it's a little specific, but it gets into, I think, something a lot of people are probably thinking about.
I'm sorry, can you read the beginning?
So if
part?
somebody's making
Conducted-
field strength measurements before and after
Oh, okay.
the transition to determine the additional interference, whether that's a reimbursable expense.
I will
Well,
ask Joe for some assistance here. If it's something that's, I would say generally if it's something that's typically done just in the course of testing, it seems reimbursable. If it's with an eye toward expanding, seeking an expansion, maybe filing in that second window, then it's not. Those costs are entirely attributable to the station.
Field strength measurements, we discussed that in the 2013 Widelity report. Many stations put up the antenna and call it a day, and that's that. They don't conduct any sort of post-construction measurements, but some groups routinely, as a matter of their policy for many, many years, have conducted these measurements after they've constructed to prove that the system does or does not work. And also, if there's a reception issue that they need to address, many times field strength measurements are conducted. So to me, that's an ordinary item that does come up.
It seems reasonable.
We have a question in the back?
Joe Wozniak, Maple Leaf RF. Is there such a thing as a partial reimbursement? Let's say that a broadcaster wants to oversize their transmitter
Yes.
in anticipation of future needs, let's say for ATSC 3.0 or for whatever. How's that handled?
I thank you for your question because that's something I intended to talk about. We refer to these as upgrades. In the report and order, what the commission said we would pay for is comparable equipment. And that's the reason why we're asking for, what is your current equipment? That's why you'll have to enter information about that on the 399. We realize for a variety of reasons, either because of the freeze, because of anticipation of the auction, or because of anticipation of 3.0, that a station may want to take this opportunity to upgrade from what it currently owns. And there will be a process for that. There will be a way to indicate on the 399 that you are going to be purchasing upgraded equipment. And the end result will be that the reimbursement will be for the amount at the comparable rate. And then the station will just pay the difference for the upgrade.
We probably have time for one more question if we've got one over here.
I've never met a chief engineer who didn't want a brand new transmitter.
Yeah.
So is there any incentive for somebody who has, let's say, a 24-month-old transmitter that's relatively new to simply just go out and buy a new filter and retune your exciter, as opposed to buy a new transmitter because the government's paying for it?
Yeah, there are some perverse incentives here. We will, to the extent you can retune equipment, we would expect people to do that. And to the extent there are costs that you incur in retuning, those are reimbursable. I think there is going to have to be some judgment about, purchasing new versus, something that's only, as you say, a few months old. But my understanding is that people have sort of been holding off on purchasing new equipment in anticipation of the repack and the auction. So hopefully there won't be too many situations like that. It'll be either the equipment is new because we had to purchase it and we're just going to retune it, or we've been holding on for a long time. It's not retunable. It's, it's channel specific and we need to purchase new.
Okay, thank you, Pam, Joe, and Patrick. Appreciate it. Round of applause.